circumstances. Modern societies are highly adaptable, they're saying, and we can adapt to these changes. And other cornucopians have dismissed those who would adopt, say, alternative lifestyles as some sort of middle-class cop-out, which does nothing to actually change the conditions under which most people in Australia, and indeed most people in the third world, actually live. And indeed, a lot of cornucopians accuse catastrophists of not caring about the poor. So while Ian Law would point out that our contemporary circumstances have led to more and more inequality, the cornucopians turn around and say, well, catastrophists don't really care about the growth, the poor at all, because low levels of economic growth will threaten jobs. It'll heighten unemployment, and it will thwart the aspirations of those parts of society who suffer most through economic recessions. And they also argue that economic development is actually necessary for contemporary environmental protection. Because without modern forms of economic growth, you'll find that poor countries will be unable to implement the higher environmental standards that are necessary for sustainability, and they will continue to extract resources which have got potential or actual harmful effects upon the environment. So poor countries need more economic growth, such as Western European countries and the United States and Australia has, if they're actually going to solve their environmental problems. That's what the cornucopians are saying. The cornucopians also accuse the sort of catastrophists of scaremongering. This is probably the key point that they make. Frightening the population at large into changing our modern, market-oriented lifestyles that are based upon freedom of choice. So they argue that the catastrophists are like the new Chicken Little, telling us that the sky is falling in. And so this is what Lars Koger in the Australian wrote a couple of years ago. The Earth's climate has been constantly changing for 4.6 billion years. If one thing about the Earth's climate is consistent, it is change. Try to blame this on the human race. To think we poor mortals can overpower the natural forces that drive climate change on this planet is ludicrous. The Green Movement will continue to try and sell us this scary green bedtime story as part of their scare campaign. Scare campaigning, after all, is their only marketing tool. So in other words, the catastrophists are your contemporary version of Chicken Little. And this is what Alan Wood, who can be regarded as another cornucopian, he is the Australian's main sort of economic editor. Rather than letting them alarm you, the catastrophists, ask yourself this: do you think people who can't tell you whether it will rain next Wednesday are really capable of building models that tell you what the climate will be like 100 years from now? So you can see these people are very sceptical about the types of forecasting that you've seen in the sort of the course so far. And the cornucopians argue that our modern capitalist society is capable of possessing inbuilt adaptive mechanisms that will prove these environmental Chicken Littles wrong. So there's a whole range of adaptations that capitalism has got within its inbuilt system that allows us to sort of be confident about the future. Firstly, they argue that our estimates of our reserve resources are unreliable, and we're always finding new reserves of sort of important resources all the time. And these will happen when the market sees fit. Also, there are backstop reserves of certain superabundant metals which we rely upon, such as iron and aluminium, which they argue are still in vast supply. And also, even in areas where there are scarcities, then the market will translate this into price rises and search for solutions such as recycling. So there are ways out of this problem. Also, they argue that technological sort of innovation is constantly creating cleaner alternatives than sort of natural resources. So if you think of 19th century industrialization and the pollution, we've found far more efficient and better ways of producing than we previously did. Synthetics and electronics will provide a cleaner forms of technological change. Probably the most famous of the cornucopians is a Danish statistician called Bjørn Lomborg. You might have heard of him. He wrote a very famous book, and very controversial book a couple of years ago, called The Skeptical Environmentalist. And he's probably emerged as the most controversial and probably the most articulate cornucopian of the 21st century. And so he argues that to the extent that we believe in doomsday is nigh, that is not true. And he actually argues in his book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, that most of our environmental indicators are going in the right direction, especially in the wealthy countries. And he also says, and they will for the underdeveloped world as soon as their economies grow and people get richer. Again, you can see how he's arguing that you need modern economic growth in order to protect the environment. And he says that he points out that this scaremongering is sort of doesn't help us at all, because he says we've always been running out of resources ever since human society began. And he says the oil age will come to an end not for the lack of oil, in the same way that the Stone Age didn't end because of a lack of stones. In other words, we will find new resources. We'll always find better and new substitutes for the way we did things in the past. And so he actually argues that we're leaving our grandkids with a greater availability of resources. We are leaving them with technology that enables them to dig deeper and even more cheaply and more efficiently. So, as you can see, he's arguing against people like Will Stephens. He's saying we can continue to sort of maintain the lifestyles that we have been accustomed to. And so, in fact, Bjørn Lomborg actually came to Australia a couple of years ago, and he really got up Ian Low's nose. The two of them had a bit of a debate. And after discussing Bjørn Lomborg's sort of ideas, this is how Ian Low referred to his work. It's all right to trash the environment to get wealthy, because then we'll be able to afford to clean up the environment. So it's Low is arguing that there's something quite irrational about the argument that cornucopians such as Lomborg have put forward. Notice how both the catastrophists and the cornucopians claim that they are principally concerned with social equity and social justice. Both of them are claiming that they care about the poor. They care about a more egalitarian society. It's just that they've got different values. They've got different ways of defining what equality means. If you think about it, the catastrophists are focusing a lot more on what we might want to call intergenerational equity. The idea that we are passing on to our grandkids sort of a less hospitable environment than we inherited. While the cornucopians are actually claiming that we need more and more economic growth if we're going to alleviate poverty and improve environmental conditions. So as we can see from what I've been talking about here, there are some people that believe that growth can and must continue into the long foreseeable future. While there are others who are more ecologically concerned, who believe that growth can continue as long as it takes into consideration sustainability. And so in many ways, if we go back to that little graph that I had, the whole concept of sustainable development has been designed over the past 20 years to illustrate that increasing levels of growth and improving environmental quality are not necessarily incompatible. In other words, we can have our cake and eat it, but we've got to be careful. So it's a way of finding a path between economic growth and environmental quality. So here's probably the most classic statement of what sustainable development is. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet those needs. But do you notice how, so that sounds